It's ready. All right, all right. Here we are with another episode of Coffee with the Founder. Got my coffee cup, got my coffee drink, and of course we got another phenomenal guest, a friend, a colleague, a true brother, Paul Gorski. Paul, we have designed these coffee talks as a way to introduce everybody to the people in the WPC family, the WPC network. A lot of people see you on the main stage, they see you in workshops, but they don't get to know kind of how you got into the work, what's the good work you do long after you leave the conference. So that's what we're trying to do here today. So let's start by just asking you, who are you? What do you do?
Yeah, well, let me say before I jump into that, how great it is to connect with you. And, you know, the White Privilege Conference has kind of been like almost like my annual going home for many years. And I'm just so grateful to have that network and be connected to you and the conference and everyone at the conference. So it's, yeah, so it's great to be talking to you. But yeah, what do I do? What the heck do I do? I've done a lot of different things in education. Mostly I'm based in education, and I've been a community educator, worked in the equity office of a school district, was a teacher educator, ran some social justice and human rights programs at the university for a while. And then about almost 2 years ago now, actually just about exactly 2 years ago now, I left academia because the work I'm most passionate about is working directly with schools and school districts around anti-racism and equity and justice issues. So I was, you know, traveling around, going to schools and school districts a lot up until about 2 months ago. But yeah, that's sort of my work. And I sort of see it as, I think there are a lot of people who kind of do like general professional development. I really see my niche as working with people who are already committed to equity and justice, but how do we help that group of people do their work as transformatively as possible? That's sort of what I think of as my niche.
Yeah. I want to ask you a little bit about, you know, kind of what you think the state of affairs are in reference to schools and school districts based on your years of work. But before that, how did you get to this point? Did you grow up thinking, hey, this is what I want to do and I'm finally doing it? I mean, how did you go from where you started to where you are now?
That's a great question. You know, I grew up in a pretty conservative family, especially my father. And I had two really important role models when I was a kid who were men of color. One was a teacher, one was a Taekwondo instructor. And I think it was kind of the gap between being at home and hearing my father tell racist jokes and then being with these men who are kind of justice oriented, but also just really loving and caring, which I wasn't necessarily getting from my dad. And I think that sort of planted a seed. And then I just became really passionate about, well, I guess I also always had kind of an overactive empathy or compassion sort of thing. You know, I'm the kind of person who cries when a tree's being cut down. You know, I can't stand any kind of violence to any living thing. So I just got really passionate about what I would have called at that time equality, you know. And then once I got into college, I kind of fell in with a group of people who were doing community education around issues like racism, homophobia, heterosexism, those sorts of things. And I just kind of latched onto that group and became addicted to the learning I was doing. I mean, in a way, it's kind of selfish, but I was so addicted to this world that was opened up to me, and I've never gotten over that addiction.
Yeah. Now, you really mentioned something that I want to ask you about also, which is, you know, the kind of groups, the kind of schools you work with, almost like, I mean, the next level. In fact, I think I read somewhere some of your tagline was no fluff kind of bringing it. And so I want to ask you about that, just kind of the toll that work, the challenge, what it means when you do it at that kind of level. But before that, what have you found? What's the grade? What's your sense of how well education, how schools are doing, how school districts are doing around these issues of diversity and inclusion?
Well, I think schools and school districts are not doing well. I want to distinguish that from individual teachers, because we both know a lot of individual teachers who, when they close their classroom doors are doing some amazing stuff. But most of the teachers who are doing that aren't getting support from their schools or districts. I think the biggest challenge is what's rewarded right now in schools and school districts isn't anti-racism, but kind of the illusion of anti-racism. So we have our student club and we have our celebrating diversity, and that sort of stuff is rewarded. But anything beyond that is, I think ostracized and punished. So we have a lot of celebrating diversity. We have a lot of kind of fluffy cultural competence stuff. But when it comes to, and we have a lot of programs. I mean, that's the other thing is the culture of education is so much about, how do we find the right combination of whatever the shiny new programs are and and strategies. How do we find the right combination of those to raise test scores? So first of all, that goal of raising test scores is not the right equity goal, but and so people are obsessed with trauma-informed this and social emotional that. And so they have these programs in place, but that is sort of replacing the equity work, which is, well, let's map out all the ways racism is operating here and let's eliminate the racism. That's what schools and districts are not doing and pretty actively avoiding doing in most cases.
Yeah, so I want to ask you about the challenges of doing equity work. I mean, the work of systemic, institutional, structural change that you are saying, hey, if you want to work with Paul Gorski, this is the work you got to be doing. So I want to just ask you, what are the challenges associated with that and how you take care of yourself? But before that, can you talk a little bit about, as you mentioned earlier, the evolution of the work, right? Like you used to be doing diversity work or work around equality. What's your sense of how the work has changed? And now that you're doing it at the level you're doing it, pushing structural, systemic, institutional change, what are some of the challenges? And then how do you take care of yourself?
Yeah, well, I think everything has been an evolution. I think as I've grown to understand racism and anti-racism more complexly, I've adjusted, how I define the problem and how I imagine the problem can be solved. And I think it's an evolution a lot of people, especially white people, probably go through. Like at one point I think, oh, okay, we just have to help the white students and the students of color get along better, kind of that intercultural education model, or then like, oh no, it's institutional, and then, oh no, it's global, and it keeps getting bigger. So it's just, I think the people who are doing the kind of work that we're doing, we have to be out ahead of that instead of behind it, because most of the institutions we work with are behind that. So I also had, mentors of color when I was in graduate school. Probably my two important mentors in terms of the social justice work I do, who were both graduate students of color who were a little older than me, both African American, who basically said, we're taking you under our wing. We know that you have the potential here, but the trade for that for you is you have to be willing to go out and do the things and say the things that we as people of color will get punished for saying. So that's where my kind of direct name the issue approach came from, was them saying, we'll mentor you, but this is the trade-off. If we catch you out there doing some fluffy shit, then we're gonna call you out on that. And so, I just made a promise and I've tried to stick with it. I mean, I think the challenge of that is that most of the gatekeepers in schools are liberal white people who are way more comfortable with celebrating diversity and cultural competence and anti-bullying and anything other than address the way you identify the way you perpetuate racism, eliminate racism, become actively anti-racist. They want, the community dialogue and the candlelight peace vigil, but, redistributing the access and the opportunity and going up against white parents, that's what I think that's the biggest challenge. To me, the biggest challenge isn't the outright racist. It's generally white liberal people who are really defensive about their shiny new programs and just don't like to be, pushed beyond that.
Yeah. Now, I know the impact of that on you doing the work is different than your colleagues of color you may have learned with. Myself, I know being on the road that we could say the exact same thing and the impact or response can be different, but it still takes a toll when you're pushing around white supremacy, structural systemic. So just wondering, what are your kind of self-care kind of tips when you're out there, but also, I want to look at this white people doing diversity work piece, which I think you're one of the people that are talking about that and the rewards, because there are consequences that are different, but also rewards that are different.
Yeah.
So can you talk about that as well?
Yeah, well, the thing about that question about sort of like taking care of myself and sort of avoiding burnout and all that sort of thing, I think about that more in terms of being parts of communities that can help take care of one another than thinking of it as sort of myself. I mean, I do things for my well-being. I try to exercise, I meditate, I try to eat healthy and all of that. But I think what really keeps me going is just being part of communities that are all kind of committed to the same thing, and being able to draw off the collective energy. Even if it's, like someone like you and I aren't in constant contact, but I kind of feel like there are like you and other people who kind of have my back and I would have your back. And I get something out of that. And I think that probably the thing that is the most rewarding or the most working with adults is really tough. The opportunities I had to work with kids, even though, kids can say hard, racist, homophobic, transphobic sort of things. The openness that children have to talk about these issues, and the youngest children are so outraged when anything is not fair. I get so much energy off of working with children. I forgot the second part there.
Well, that second part is the rewards in a different way around compensation, the elevation of, white thoughts, white voice, especially around doing diversity work, just how you grapple with that, white people getting paid for diversity work and sometimes getting paid as a white person differently than a person of color, just all the difficult, sticky, challenging stuff around that.
Yeah, it is really challenging. I mean, it's something that I think about a lot. And in that foreword to that book, what was the name of the book about
Everyday White People?
Everyday White People. I'm kind of grappling with that. And some of the white people who wrote chapters were not too happy about my foreword, the way I was naming some of the stuff I was naming in there, which was kind of interesting. But it's tough. And I'm very self-conscious about that. I'm consciously self-conscious. So the deal that I've kind of made a couple of deals with myself. The first one is that I know even in the context of doing racial equity work, especially in schools, that whiteness is even privileged, even in the context of racial justice work. And it'll be no surprise to you that occasionally I'll get a call where somebody will say, we want to bring you in because we think people will be able to hear this from a white person better than they can hear it from somebody else. And what's interesting is what they need to hear is usually already contained in the knowledge of the people of color in their own organization. If they just listened to the people in their own organization. So I've thought about this in a couple ways. One is that's part of the reason why I have kind of an unflinching, direct approach. I think a lot of people who do diversity work take the fluffier approach because they get a lot more work taking the fluffier approach because schools can bring them in. It's not going to be intimidating. Check it off the list. So if I'm going in, I'm anti-racism work. That's what I'm doing. Anti-white supremacy work, and I'm going to name it. But the other thing is, I've also committed to, when I'm building my organizations that are doing that kind of consulting work, I never build it around myself. So there's no, Gorski and Associates or Paul Gorski LLC. It's EdChange or it's Equity Literacy Institute. And then I have teams of people who I work with who are predominantly, almost entirely people of color, so that I can take the kind of stage that I'm given, that people give me because of my whiteness, and I can share it or say, I'll do this, but I'm bringing, Marceline DuBose with me, or Tahari Jackson with me, or Seema Pothini with me, or one of my team members, so that, again, I'm sort of building out with the community of people that are already my inner circle doing this work, all of whom, by the way, are doing way better work than me. And just because they haven't written a book, they just don't have the visibility that I have. So, so that's something I can try to address.
So can you talk a little bit about COVID-19, all right? Because, hey, we've been at it for a while, chipping away. And I know things have been up, things have been down, all of that. But this COVID-19, this pandemic has essentially stopped us in our place to maybe do some reflecting and reevaluating, reassessing, all of that. So I'm wondering, what have you been thinking about in reference to education due to having some time to just kind of reflect on your work, your life's work up to this point? And then also, as we look to go ahead, what do you foresee as some of the challenges as things get back to normal, whatever that means?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'd actually love to hear your thoughts on this too, because I know you and I are both, and a lot of our friends and colleagues are out on the road a lot. And I think one of the things I'm learning from this process is how much of a toll that was taking on me, being out on the road. And it's like the work itself takes a toll, of course, but the airports and the hotels and the being away from friends and family and, standing in line to rent cars, all that stuff. So I think I have come to a decision that I got to figure out how not to be on the road as much, even when people can get back on the road. I just feel like I'm missing out on life a little too much. So that's one thing I've been thinking about. A positive side also is that it's given me a chance to do things I've been wanting to do for a long time. So, I wanted to be able to put some of my professional development work online so more people could access it. So I was able to create these, free, self-paced online courses that people could take, which is something I've been wanting to do for a long time. So that's good. So, so I think going back to normal for me is not going to be going back to what I've been doing. I just don't think that was sustainable, and it was having an impact on my health. So I'm going to try to cut my travel back. And I'm also wondering about you, because I don't know this for a fact, but somebody told me once that most people probably think that you're pretty extroverted, but actually naturally you're somewhat introverted. So it's not necessarily natural for you to always be around big crowds. And you know, I could really relate to that. And I wonder how that impacts you when you're on the road.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's. I think I do have a dual personality in that way that I do draw. Being an old athlete, being in sports for all of my life, I do draw some energy from that group participation. I mean,
Mhm.
staged in that way, but not necessarily being at a party, hanging out in that way. I don't need that to kind of draw my fuel. And so in some ways, I've lost that kind of applause that helps refuel me. But I've also been able to kind of just discover and strengthen and understand what is possible when I'm alone, when I'm by myself, when I'm reflecting, because I think sometimes there is a pull between the applause and the individual reflection. The other thing I've learned, I mean, I used to say this, and I think we hear this a lot, that relationships take work, but most of my relationships has been, in this airport kind of scenario, right? And even to some extent at home, so this has, even though my wife and I met and really built our relationship with me in travel mode, I mean, we've had a different kind of relationship now that you got to work on in general when you're in a relationship, but now it's just a different kind of work, and it's been both challenging and rewarding, and plus with the kids around. So there's been some real work that I've had to do, now being at home just in relationship. And then I think the last thing for me is now, I mean, I'm at that age, I think we're at that age now, I want to think about what am I going to leave behind. And this 50 something days, and who knows how many, how high that number would get, but it's at least giving me some time to think about, I mean, what has been the contribution that I've made, and what's that going to look like, and how to carry that on, how to leave stuff behind, how to be, elevating folks, giving folks a chance. Cause I've had enough dances in the end zone, so to speak. I'd like some other people to experience that and really try to support and assist people, trying to remember the lessons I wish I would have learned. So that's kind of, all the things I've been thinking about during this time. Because, yeah, we've been at it a while, man. I mean, as you look at your work and your talks, your publications, your teaching, what's your sense of how we're doing, those of us who've been at it for so long, now that we've had time to almost like stop and do a grading and assessment? I mean, has this work of diversity and inclusion been working?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. And then a question is, it's funny because when I look at institutions, I don't see a lot of movement, but I know there's been some movement. I mean, at the very least, schools and school districts and colleges and universities have to be doing something, or they look like they're completely out of touch. Sometimes the something that they're doing is not particularly transformative in the way we'd probably like to see it. There's a lot of intergroup dialogue programs at universities. There's not a lot of anti-racist universities. So we seem to have made some progress in that way. Or just think about, when we just first got started in this work, there were so few places people could go to get formal training on how to do this work. And now things like that exist, so I think that's progress. But also, I don't know if this is your experience, but when I left George Mason University a couple of years ago, the undergrad students who were coming into my social justice courses, their understanding and consciousness was way past anything I had when I was a college student. And they're talking about, like, and the way that they're talking about gender identity and expression and all of these other sorts of things. So something's happening, something's happening to kind of push things forward. The other thing I notice is that, when I look at the white privilege conference and how it has evolved, and I look at, some of our colleagues and friends and the way their work has evolved, and that's also a sign of progress,
Yeah.
and so I think, we're up against hard stuff, and so I think we're not making the progress we wish we were making, but I don't think that's going to stop us.
Yeah, yeah. I was wondering if you've been in all white spaces with no people of color around and what's being said. I mean, if you've been undercover, I mean, I know if you're in those spaces as Paul Gorski, you're gonna say something, you're gonna challenge. But I just wonder if you've ever found yourself just having a sense of the state of white America around these issues. I remember the Kerner report came out and they're talking about, all these disparities. Yet when you were asking white people, it seemed like they thought, hey, things are great. What do you mean racism? Right? So I'm wondering, like today, what's your sense of, as we look at this recent, public assassination of this young brother in Georgia? I'm wondering, like, what's the average, ordinary white person thinking connected to understanding around these issues? You have any sense of that?
Well, I think there's sort of a kind of white conservative and white liberal response. I think the white liberal response is usually temporary outrage. Someone else gets murdered. Let me post something on social media. Let me go for a run and post that kind of thing. There's that kind of temporary, often kind of expression of outrage or there's like this, okay, now we really need to do something. Trump got elected, now we really need to do something. Another, dude gets murdering for jogging while black. Now we really got to do something. I think that's, it's like, no, we really needed to be doing something all along so that this wouldn't have happened to begin with. So, I think that's kind of the constant state of kind of that white liberal mentality. I think, being in the course of my work, being in some predominantly white rural environments, I think there's a sense that things have turned now, and now white people are the ones who are at risk of, feeling oppressed. And in a way, I think Trump has kind of given people permission or a framework to grab onto that idea more tightly. I guess that's always been there, but it feels like at least it's more explicit now. I think the percentage of white people who are at least somewhat curious about diversity is probably bigger than it was 20 years ago, but I don't necessarily think that means that they are doing anything meaningful about equity or justice.
So if you had the opportunity, to give a message during this time, particularly to the people who want to do better. We face pushback and all that kind of stuff. I don't want to spend my energy with the most resistant people anymore. I want to be working with people who want to do better. So if you had an opportunity to address folks who want to do better, who want to improve and go forward in a better way, what would be your message today if you had to do a 2-minute, 3-minute PSA to folks who want to do better as we move forward?
Well, I'm going to think specifically about what my message might be to white people who wanted to do that first, because I think, I don't know if you've seen these studies I've done about racial justice activist burnout, but in one of them I interviewed racial justice activists of color who have experienced burnout about their biggest source of burnout. And they reported their biggest source of burnout to be the attitudes and actions of white racial justice activists, not white people in general, but white people who are in the movements and organizations that they're in. So one thing I'll say for, fellow white people like me is that we have got to get our shit together before we start asserting ourselves in those movements, because we can end up being a drain on people of color, an additional drain on people of color who are fighting for their own liberation. So white people with a focus on taking on other white people, and to avoid, going into spaces where people are doing racial justice work and trying to fluff that work up to make it more comfortable for ourselves. I think that's really important. I think doing more reading, and I think I think it's become somewhat comfortable for white people to read about white privilege and to read about white fragility and some of these things that white people are writing about whiteness. But I think digging into some of the stuff around critical race theory, which just provides a different lens, like a critique of liberalism as part of critical race theory, not liberalism as compared to conservatism, but liberalism as compared to having a real anti-racist transformative vision. Reading things like, Kimberly Crenshaw, the people who are writing, using critical race theory just as a different lens to understand what it takes to do racial justice work.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking of like James Cohen, who, is a renowned Black theologist who's written some great work around religion and white supremacy that I don't think, like you're saying, people are having great acts. Or Francis Cress Welsing, who I remember had such an impact on me in coming up with the idea and the framework for the White Privilege Conference, as well as Naeem Akbar, who's been to the White Privilege Conference. I'm wondering just in general how many liberal good white folks even know who those are. But that's a good point towards the end, to just be reading beyond white social justice written by white social justice people. Even though some of my best social justice friends are white. It's not that I have any problem with that, but that's a good point.
It's also that it's not a knock on those people.
Right.
I just think that there are some ways of framing things that have become kind of safe and comfortable, for white people, and, getting into some of those other pieces, like I remember the first time I read Faces at the Bottom of the Well by Derek Bell.
Yeah.
It just gave me a whole different framework. Or the first time I read Gloria Anzaldua's book, Borderlands, it just gave me a whole different framework from some of the stuff that I had been reading, and it just expanded my understanding, or it just gave me a different kind of depth. Even going back and reading James Baldwin, James Baldwin was talking about white privilege.
Yeah.
He maybe wasn't using the term white privilege, but he's talking about white privilege and white fragility without using those terms, decades ago. And experience reading that through the lens, reading that coming from a person of color, I think can be quite powerful.
Yeah, if you can, when we hang up, just write down 10 of those authors or publications, and we'll add that to the interview, because I think that's really a great resource to add. Let me ask you about the next 10 years as you look at what you want to do, what you're thinking about doing, but also if you could just tell people how they could follow you or learn about the work you've been doing, just as a resource as well. So what's on the horizon the next 10 years?
Uh, yeah, so, well, if people want to follow me, the Equity Literacy Institute website is a great way to connect with me and this amazing team of people that I work with. I just started a Patreon page, which has been kind of interesting, where I can share things. I haven't really figured out other ways to share. So look at me up on Patreon, social media. I'm on Twitter and Facebook. But in terms of the next 10 years, I don't know, I know I want to do some mentoring for other people who are trying to sort of get into this work. I know I want to do a lot more writing and a little less traveling. Uh, and I think I'm focusing more on I've been working so much directly with schools, and I think I'm learning that a lot of work also needs to be done with school boards. And I think making that transition is important, because often, I don't know if this is the case for you, but when I get invited into a school district, I never see the school board. So sometimes I never see the superintendent, or the superintendent will come and say hi, and that's the last time I see the superintendent. So, I'm thinking about that. Also, one of the people in the Equity Literacy Institute is doing some interesting work around racial justice and military organizations. And I'm kind of curious about that. So maybe looking into that a little bit.
Well, I'm sure people ask you all the time, how can I do what you do? How did you get started? How can I be a public speaker? I mean, if you're running into a 20-something or a young person or a person changing careers and they want to get into public speaking or social justice work, consulting, what's your advice? What are you sharing with people when they ask you, how can I do what you do?
Usually I say you want to have broad expertise, but you want to find a kind of a niche for yourself. So what are you saying that everyone else isn't saying? So I think that's a piece, or saying it maybe in a way that other people aren't saying it. I think that's a piece. I think any kind of, the best thing I ever did actually was I made a choice very early on not to feel too much, not to feel ownership over my work. Like, I have no real proprietary feelings. So everything I do, I just sort of put it out there. And, anytime I write an article, I just post it. Anyone can use it. Any exercises or activities that I use, I post it. Whenever I make a handout that I'm going to use in a workshop, I'll make it available to anyone else who wants to use it. And I didn't do that for the purpose of getting invitations to do stuff, but it did help get my ideas out there. So it resulted, I think, probably in that. And the other thing is, I think, I was so passionate about this work that I was going to every event I could find. Anytime there's a little local, 100-person conference on diversity in education or whatever, I was going to it because I wanted to learn about how to present effectively, and I wanted to practice. And I was doing that for years before I ever started getting invited to do anything. So, I mean, as you know, it's hard work. It's not just the content knowledge, but figuring out how to present the content in an engaging way and an accessible way. It's hard work. So just, being willing to put the work into doing that, I think helps.
Yeah, let me ask you a couple more things before I let you go, Paul. One is, I'm always talking about and saying, and maybe it's a presumption, and you could help me out with this, that by coming to white privilege, presenting at white privilege, it can assist, support you in your life, your career, especially if this is the work you want to do throughout, afterwards. Is that true? Has the White Privilege Conference, can you talk a little bit about if and how the White Privilege Conference has supported, assisted, challenged your life, your career up to this point?
Of all the gatherings of people who do this work, the White Privilege Conference immediately became the most important and favorite one in my life. Part of that was, I think before I started presenting at the White Privilege Conference, I already had a fairly good, decent visibility, but of course you get broader visibility because there are more people there, thousands of people there. And, so that certainly helps, especially if you do well when you're presenting there. I think one of the things that's really unique about the White Privilege Conference too is that the presenters are vetted. There's all different kinds of presenters. There's community activists, there's educators. And that was amazing for me too, because as you know, most of these kind of conferences, it's like one group of people, like NCORE, the higher ed people, for the most part, are higher ed people. There aren't many spaces where you have educators, community activists, higher ed people, people from medical backgrounds, all these different kinds of places. And the relationship building across those sectors was huge. But the most important thing for me was just a place where I could kind of feel at home, because I'm really introverted. I'm pretty socially awkward, I think. So having a place where I could be somewhere, being somewhere where, it's like most of the places people who do the kind of work we do go, it can feel like we're the outcasts, or we're coming in talking about something a lot of people don't want to hear about. But then you go to the White Privilege Conference and it's like, it's like, we're not the outcasts anymore. So that kind of affirmation is pretty amazing as well.
Yeah, thank you. We're starting to think about the 25th anniversary. So it's been helpful for us to be thinking about just, the ways, the partnerships, essentially what we're trying to do with Coffee Talks is to talk about the family, the network, the community. So thank you for that. Before we let you go, we've been asking people, is there anything you've been streaming, you've been watching, you've been reading, you've been listening to during quarantine that you'd like to share? Since people have a little extra time on their hands, we're creating a list. Here's what you may want to watch, or here's what I've watched and liked during quarantine. And it can be something educational, or it can be something that just allows you to chill out.
Oh gosh. Well, I've been reading, there's a Vietnamese Buddhist monk named Thich Nhat Hanh, and people who are in the mindfulness community will be familiar with his name. But because I've been experiencing some stress and anxiety, I've been trying to read books that, just help me think about breathing, and being in the moment and not constantly worrying. So, and his books have a very calming influence on me. He has a book called No Mud, No Lotus, which is kind of about, well, of course, we're imperfect beings, and if there's no messiness, then it's not going to produce the flower. So that is probably my favorite one of those. In terms of watching, I don't know, this is a little embarrassing, but there was a show, I think it was mostly on in the mid-90s, called Dr. Katz. It was a cartoon about this guy who is a professional therapist, but all of his patients are comedians. So it's real comedians playing themselves doing their own voices, coming in and getting therapy from this pretend therapist. And I've been watching back episodes of that just because it's light and it makes me laugh.
Well, laughter is important. We just had a guest talking a little bit about the importance of laughter in our life, especially during this time. Paul Gorski, man, I appreciate you coming on board to talk a little bit about your work, your life's work, your journey, and we're looking forward to staying in touch, collaborating with you, partnering with you. As long as you're a partner, we'll be there with you, my brother.
All right, that sounds good.
Well, listen, be safe, take care of yourself. WPC 23 and 22 right now is scheduled to come to Charlotte, North Carolina. So we
All right.
hope to work with you to get a good group of folks there from the area.
Yeah.
But yeah, take care, man, and stay in touch. And anything we can do to support and amplify, collaborate, let us know.
All right, same to you, Eddie. Good talking to you.
All right, appreciate you. Peace.